If one were asked to construct a list of the great men of our time, that list would no doubt include Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Xi Jinping, the three great rulers of the true sovereign powers. As Xi Jinping rose as the leader of China, he would begin with a sweeping anti-corruption campaign. Many in the West, looking from the outside, would say that this was nothing more than a power grab, yet there appears to be more nuance to it. On the one hand, the entities that he was moving against were a genuine threat to his nationalist faction. There was some very real deep corruption in China, yet at the same time this was solidifying and seizing power. Western voices claim that this is inherently wrong, but think oneself to be a Chinese nationalist, one concerned with the rising influence of foreign finance and the powerful business figures in Shanghai and Hong Kong who had aligned with them. What is the correct course of action? Well, the Chinese decided that their best move was to get those elements out. Of course, Western interests would take objection to this, as this was a move of Chinese sovereignty, pushing back some of the influence that the West had accumulated in the nation. So was this a self-interested power grab? Well, one could certainly see it as such. It did solidify his power. Yet at the same time, was there corruption? And were there threats posed by these entities? Well, that seems to also be true. Despite the increased concern of these entities and moves to solidify China against foreign interests, the 2010s saw increased internationalization. The Chinese would begin the Belt and Road Initiative. At the beginning of Xi's tenure, China was in a predicament. China's national stability and the perceived legitimacy of its government were dependent on the rapid growth that had been seen over the prior decades. However, as the 2010s began, its economic growth model was slowing. The Belt and Road Initiative would be its solution. At inception, the idea was that infrastructure abroad could sustain the export-led economy of China. It could further secure energy and resource routes, and it could reduce regional development imbalances, linking coastal prosperity to inland and western provinces. In September of 2023, at Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan, Xi Jinping would announce the Silk Road Economic Belt, an overland trade and infrastructure route linking China to Central Asia and then to Europe. The following month, while addressing the Indonesian parliament, he would as well announce a 21st century maritime Silk Road, a route linking China to Southeast Asia, to the Indian Ocean, and then further on to Africa and Europe. This was presented as a win-win proposition, and it would be referred to as a community of shared future for mankind. A project increasing international connectivity, something that would be mutually beneficial for all nations involved, and with China as the new hub of Eurasian trade. In November the following year, Xi would announce a $40 billion Silk Road Fund, drawing funding from China's foreign exchange reserves. This move sent out a very strong signal. For so long, the mechanism by which foreign interests had attempted to integrate themselves in with China was primarily focused on the Western financial system. Think back to China's rapid economic rise. So much of that came from Eurodollar financing. Yet Xi and his faction wanted China to be independent of this. He wanted a funding mechanism outside of Western finance, and particularly independent of the IMF or World Bank. Further to this end, in April of 2015, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank would be established, beginning with 57 member countries. This international connectivity project would expand rapidly. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative would spread to Africa, Latin America, and the Pacific. It would initially begin as a series of infrastructure projects, and as these projects became more and more entrenched in the nations that they were in, China would rapidly accumulate an enormous amount of soft power. Here, people begin to heavily criticize the Belt and Road Initiative, similar to methods used by the international Western banks like the World Bank or IMF. There would be instances of countries within China's initiative being unable to make the payments that they were required. As a result, there would be instances of the Chinese seizing these assets from the countries. China would thereby gain enormous economic control in these countries. And so many in the West would begin to frame this as an imperial project, as though the Belt and Road Initiative was China's attempt to create a colonial empire. Yet China's history is different than that of the Western empires. It has a quite different strategy to it. Now, many who are on the extreme the other way make claims that China has never been an aggressor. China has always just taken care of itself and left everybody else alone. This isn't true either. However, China's effective empires of history generally functioned via tributary states. They wouldn't invade nor form colonies, but via the acquisition of influence, via a sort of diplomatic racketeering, via implied threats, or via mutually beneficial arrangements, China has historically created tributary states, functional vassals, countries and kingdoms which had to pay the Chinese. Perhaps this is a better model to consider the Belt and Road Initiative within. It's a soft power expansion mechanism. It doesn't necessarily seek extraction, and this is a proposition that has looked quite good for many countries who have become tired of being able to only look toward the Western powers, yet it doesn't come with no cost. So the question for many weaker countries is who they would rather align with, the Western financial empires or the Chinese trade network. And though this is oversimplified and metaphoric, with the choice being between being a colony or a tributary, and there were many who thought that they would get a better deal from the Chinese. China's soft power was growing rapidly, and at this point, the Western powers could no longer ignore the sheer power accumulated by the Chinese. It was now becoming clear that neither could the Chinese be contained, nor would they become like the West. Though China was becoming more powerful, and though the initiative was bringing great optimism into the country, a 2015 stock market crash would lead to substantial capital flight. As a result, the Chinese would begin significant supply-side structural reform, entering into a process of deleveraging. There was a very fine line that the Chinese needed to walk. China had become highly levered, and so much of the Chinese economic system had become backed up by real estate investments. The Chinese had to make sure that their asset base did not crash, yet they were also becoming increasingly concerned about spending and about debt. The Chinese were attempting to create a new economic model. In 2017, speaking before the 19th Party Congress, Xi would give a speech on Xi thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, an ideology which would be incorporated into the party's constitution. He was becoming increasingly concerned with rural-urban economic imbalances. Some stability problems were beginning to creep into China. Much of the excitement of the growth promise was being eroded, and much of the country felt left behind. Yet worse than that, demographic problems were beginning to become a real concern. The share of the elderly population was simply too high to be supported by the young. And worse than that, it was becoming evident that there was an excess of young men who would earn the name bare branches. There were becoming many unemployed young men who felt that they had no chance of starting a family. And so the party was becoming concerned that these young men may engage in activities like gambling, drug abuse, crime, or involvement with prostitutes. Having a very large share of your population be young men without attachments is a very unstable place to be. Quite often in history, the solution has been to send them to war. Yet during these years, something else was beginning to arise. The global economic status quo was being rejected in the United States as well. While the Chinese had become weary of foreign financial interests, the Americans had become weary of the Chinese, particularly with the scale of offshoring that had occurred and the rapid growth of the Chinese economy. Thus, in 2018, under the new American President Donald Trump, an effective trade war would begin between the two countries. One of the biggest moves during this period was the imposition of sizable tariffs. In March of 2018, the United States would impose 25% global tariffs on steel and 10% on aluminum. In response, the Chinese would retaliate, tariffing American goods such as soybeans and cars. In July, the American administration would launch a formal trade war, with 25% tariffs on around $34 billion of Chinese imports, particularly targeting goods such as electronics and machinery. The Chinese would respond with symmetrical tariffs. This would only escalate with subsequent waves. By September, over $200 billion in Chinese goods were being tariffed. Going into 2019, this trade war would escalate. In the summer of that year, the US would raise tariffs to 25% on over $200 billion in Chinese goods. The Trump administration would threaten further tariff hikes. Both sides were looking for a resolution, although at this point, negotiations would repeatedly stall. A breakthrough would occur in October, when the United States and China would begin partial truce talks. There's a very interesting economic battle between these two nations. The main economic leverage that the Chinese could hope to gain is to be a monopoly. People are quite familiar with the power of monopolies. If there is only one producer, or one producer who is so dominant as to functionally be a monopoly, then there is enormous pricing power that producer has. Yet the United States has a contrary power, something that people are quite less familiar with. Though not total, the United States has power as a monopsony. Consider the inverse of a monopoly. If there is only one functional buyer in a market, then that buyer has an enormous amount of pricing power. We can see this strategy being attempted by the European Union. The idea of pulling together the purchasing power of the nations of the EU and structuring deals and regulations in such a way as to become the dominant consumer. Though the United States was not a pure monopsony, nor were the Chinese a pure monopoly, it was monopolistic power that the Chinese were negotiating with, and monopsonistic power that the Americans were negotiating with. The question of the fight, which one had more power? In January of 2020, the Phase 1 trade deal would be signed. China would agree to purchase $200 billion more goods from the United States over the next 2 years, while the United States would suspend some tariff hikes. At the same time that all of this was happening, cracks were beginning to form in the Chinese real estate sector. In the years leading up to 2018, the government had intensified the message of houses are for living, not for speculation. The Chinese real estate sector had really grown out of control. In the United States, most people have their wealth parked in funds that hold things like equities or bonds. Even people who aren't investors quite often have exposure through vehicles like 401ks or IRAs. In China, this isn't the case. In China, the core asset that everyone is bound to is real estate. One key reason for this is that finance in China is done differently. Credit isn't done against future cash flow expectations. In general, lending in China is done against hard assets like real estate. Throughout the 2010s, it would become normal for some middle-class grandmother to have a condo somewhere she has never been to. And more than that, real estate had become a very important social status signifier. If you're a young man in China who wants to get married, you'd better have some real estate to show for yourself. In 2018, as the Chinese-American trade war was beginning, local governments would tighten purchase restrictions and mortgage rules in major cities, attempting to cool the price of the real estate sector. This would have an effect. Real estate investment growth would slow. However, real estate made up around 20 to 30% of Chinese GDP growth. The real estate sector had become an absolute monster in China. So much of its economy was based on it. In 2019, Chinese GDP growth would slow to 6%, its slowest growth rate in decades. Regulators would crack down on developer leverage, as well as increasing restrictions on shadow bank financing. This year, the 3 red lines limit would be introduced, limiting lending on the lines of debt-to-cash ratios, debt-to-asset ratios, and debt-to-equity ratios. As a result, major Chinese real estate developers would begin facing some tight constraints. Housing prices would begin to stabilize or decline slightly in Tier 1 cities. The 3 red lines policy would begin being formally enforced in 2020. This would have an enormous impact on the sector, with major real estate developers facing serious liquidity squeezes. The government would introduce targeted support for smaller developers, while maintaining an overall deleveraging push. So when we look at the start of 2020, what do we see for China? We see some social strain beginning to emerge. We see a much more nationalist government forming and consolidating around Xi Jinping. We see a very strong effort to push out foreign financial interests. We see an economy beginning to slow down and looking outward in order to propel itself. A country attempting to use foreign infrastructure investment and soft power to solidify its position and to retain the sense of government legitimacy. We see economic conflict emerging between the US and China, and all the while, the enormous real estate sector that had become so core to the Chinese economy beginning to shake. Yet if one thinks of the year of 2020 and thinks of the country China, none of these are what come to mind. Beginning in December of 2019, a viral outbreak would begin in Wuhan. In January the following year, a national lockdown would begin. Xi and the party would conduct a centralized response, referring to this as the People's War. The economy would contract 6.8% in the first quarter of 2020, and as economic and social stability were beginning to worsen, there would be a very strong narrative push toward nationalism and the perception of strength of the Chinese and the Chinese government. The film Wolf Warrior would become a major cultural point, depicting a fierce, honorable, and heroic Chinese figure, a nationalist warrior loyal to China. This was the image that the party was now presenting to the people, the fierce, tough, and bold Chinese. At this time, while the country was under a strict lockdown, China's central bank was expanding its experiment on a digital currency. This idea was gaining a lot of traction across the world. One of the earliest institutions to explore the idea of central bank digital currencies was the Bank for International Settlements. Yet central banks across the West, including the Bank of England and the European Central Bank, would soon follow. Countries across the world were realizing that the debt binge they had been engaged in was unsustainable. China had its own unique currency strategy, a dual circulation approach. The country operated under two distinct currency systems, one internal and one external. The idea being to have a domestic focus while maintaining global integration. Economic and social issues were rising. Youth unemployment was not improving. The demographic situation remained in crisis, and there had been a growing pessimism amongst the youth, a pessimism that was substantially exacerbated by the lockdowns. Year over year in 2020, Chinese GDP would grow at a rate of 2.3%. At least, official figures would show that. Going into 2021, concerns would begin to grow in the bond market, with eyes turning to the very high levels of corporate debt. As these debt problems were worsening, it would particularly hit one of China's most sensitive sectors, real estate. The most high-profile example of this liquidity strain hurting the real estate sector in China can be seen through the Evergrande Group. As real estate developers were beginning to get liquidity squeezed, the enormous real estate developer Evergrande would find itself unable to make payments. In August of 2021, construction would halt on many Evergrande projects due to overtime payments to suppliers and contractors. Around this time, the liquidity crisis in the sector would begin to become public knowledge. In September, Evergrande would miss interest payments on offshore bonds, totaling $131 million. Shares of the company would plunge, and credit rating agencies would downgrade it. In December, international rating agencies would declare Evergrande to be in default. This was an enormous hit to the sector. No longer was this liquidity crisis merely theoretical. A major developer had now fallen, and as so much of the Chinese economy and the Chinese people had their own wealth and futures tied up in real estate, this was an extremely concerning event. People were now beginning to wonder if their futures were actually secure, and particularly as so much of the Chinese financial system is collateralized by real estate, there were significant contagion concerns. In 2022, formal restructuring talks would begin, all while missed payments and creditor lawsuits would continue to accumulate. The government would coordinate the completion of some yet unfinished projects. Serious problems in the Chinese economy that had existed under the surface for some time were now beginning to bubble up, and those in foreign financial markets were taking notice. While China was very clearly going in a more nationalist direction, the relationship between the government and businesses hadn't quite been clearly defined. In 2021, the position of Xi Jinping's government would become quite clear. This year would see very strong moves against perceived foreign interests. While being nominally socialist, China had developed an enormous private sector. Founders and businessmen had built enormous fortunes. One of the most famous examples of these massive Chinese businessmen is Jack Ma. Jack Ma was an absolute titan. Particularly through his company, Alibaba, he had become an enormous player in Chinese business, and extremely wealthy. The arrangement between the Chinese state and its businessmen was that entrepreneurs were allowed to build businesses. Founders were allowed to start companies. The growth of businessmen like this wasn't perceived as a problem by the state. That was, so long as their growth aligned with common prosperity. Businessmen were allowed to get rich as long as it benefited the country and they did not involve themselves in politics. Going back decades now, the more nationalists within the party had always been concerned with some of the business elements that existed in and around the party. There was concern that businessmen may be accumulating too much power in the country, but it wasn't business itself, nor the accumulation of wealth that was the problem. The problem is when men like these started getting into the political arena. On October 24th of 2020, Jack Ma would give a high-profile speech criticizing Chinese financial regulators and banks, stating that they had developed a pawn-shop mentality, one that was stifling innovation. Only about a week later, regulators would summon Jack Ma and the executives of his company, the Ant Group, for a meeting. At this point, Jack Ma was setting up for an enormous IPO of the Ant Group. It was set up to be a $37 billion IPO in Shanghai and Hong Kong. However, the next day, this IPO would be halted, only days before it was scheduled to happen. Not long after, the State Administration for Market Regulation would launch an antitrust investigation into Alibaba, and not long after, Jack Ma would vanish from public view. His disappearance would spark curiosity and conjecture, ultimately being functionally gone for months. So let's look at what happened. And in line with the approach that this channel has been taking, let's tell the story two different ways. First, let's begin with the more familiar Western story, the story told by those who favor Jack's position. In this story, an insecure government wanted to secure its power. For years, Xi Jinping had been consolidating power, squishing down those he thought to be a political threat. In this quest to assert power, Xi's government would retaliate against Jack Ma for his criticism of the regulators. In doing this, the government caused significant damage to the entrepreneurial spirit of the country. Why would one want to be an innovator and build a big business if it meant that the government eye was now zoomed in on you? This was squishing down innovation. This was squishing down capital risk-taking. It's an exemplar of state capitalism. You're allowed to be a businessman so long as you don't upset the government. And at this point, in 2020 and 2021, Xi Jinping was easily upset, and they simply could not tolerate criticism, nor seeing a man such as Ma gaining so much power outside of the party. And now let's take the Chinese state position. What is the story told by them? Well, their story is that they had allowed these businessmen to grow and flourish. Ultimately, the Chinese economy is a state economy, and the entire purpose for that economy is to serve the Chinese whole. These businessmen had been given enormous opportunity and privilege, gaining incredible lifestyles because they were in service of the Chinese, the common prosperity. The agreement was understood. They were allowed to have this excellent privilege so long as they operated as businessmen and not in politics. Going back to the Century of Humiliation, the influence of these foreign financial empires was perhaps the worst threat that China had ever faced, and many of the Shanghai-type businessmen had become very close to these financial entities. So now the state was allowing men to get rich, all while these men were entangling themselves with Western capital. This was already a threat that the state was very sensitive to, yet perhaps a delicate balance could be reached. However, as the years went on, it became evident that these interests were attempting to make a move and grab more power in China. Jack Ma was one of these men. So for Jack Ma to become so bold as to now directly criticize the government, all while controlling so much Chinese industry and capital, heavily influenced by foreign finance, well, this simply could not stand. Alibaba and Ant Group had consolidated simply too much power. That much power could not be in the hands of someone aligned with foreign capital. The state had a duty to protect consumers from monopolies, and the government had clear authority over disorderly capital expansion, a duty to ensure common prosperity. It was the state's duty to rein in the power of this monopolistic firm and this foreign-affiliated rogue businessmen. So which story is true? Well, maybe they both are. Of course, you are going to see it one way or the other based on where you sit. It is perfectly reasonable to think that the Chinese government should be concerned with foreign finance, NGOs, agencies, and interests. That was fundamental to the very core of the Chinese psyche. It's reasonable to engage in antitrust. How much power would we, in the supposedly free market capital West, allow a Chinese-affiliated businessman to have? Is there any point at which we might get antitrust law involved? And on the inverse, if you're thinking with the mind of a Westerner, or perhaps a tech founder in particular, wouldn't you become more concerned at this point? Wouldn't you be more weary if you were attempting to build a business in China? Of course, this is an example of the state trying to strengthen its grip. Now, you can debate one way or another as to whether the state went too far, but ultimately, the decision was made. And whether the state is a hero or villain in the story, well, maybe that's just up to who you want to win. All the while, as the government was cracking down on foreign influences, there remained a long-simmering problem, one that had been a concern for Chinese nationalists and sovereigntists for generations: Hong Kong. In March of 2021, the National People's Congress would pass a declaration on improving the electoral system of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. It would include changes to how the Hong Kong electoral system worked, and increase restrictions on who was able to run. The crux of the declaration being that only those deemed patriots could administer Hong Kong. In May, the Hong Kong legislature would pass these changes, reducing elected seats in the Legislative Council from 35 to 20, out of 90 total seats. They would as well create new election committee vetting mechanisms, designed to be much more selective as to who would be allowed to run for those seats. The changes would be implemented that summer, with most pro-democracy candidates being disqualified. The government was as well turning to the Hong Kong media, and foreign media that had made its way into China. In June of 2021, the offices of the pro-democracy publication Apple Daily would be raided, with founder Jimmy Lai and members of the senior staff being arrested. The publication would ultimately shut down. Around the same time, foreign media was being forced out. Several media firms, including the BBC, Reuters, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and CNN, would all come under increased Chinese scrutiny, facing significantly more regulatory and legal harassment, greatly heightened restrictions, and being forced to relocate staff. There would be a wave of closures of the Hong Kong arms of these firms. The Xi Jinping government was forcing out foreign influence. Again, we come to the story problem. Of course, the Western media frame this as an awful, authoritarian, autocratic government forcing out democracy and imposing its will on those poor Chinese people who will never get to experience liberalism. While the Chinese tell a story of, we are not going to allow foreign entities to infiltrate and influence our society again. We are not doing the Canton opium trade too. So which of these stories is right? Well, again, neither of them are wrong. Just to take a momentary detour into the nature of propaganda, you can turn one of those stories into the other with very few intermediary steps. The difference between the story is really just framing and word choice. Let's start with the Chinese claim. In the interests of the Chinese people and Chinese civilization, the government forced out meddling foreign influences who were attempting to manipulate China for their own gain. Let's just move this story a little bit. The Chinese government forced out foreign firms who were attempting to affect change in China to align with Western ideas and Western interests. Just another little step. The authoritarian government of China forced out pro-democracy media firms to make sure that the Chinese people would not align with the West. And one last step. The paranoid authoritarian Chinese government forced out the free liberal media to ensure that the people would not be exposed to democratic ideas. At no point have we fundamentally changed the story of what happened. So neither are wrong, but again, it goes back to what your own interests are. That's how you're going to see what happened. By the time of 2022, Chinese lockdowns had become very intense, with a stated goal of having 0 cases. Ultimately, the internal tension would become extremely high, and there would be widespread protests. That year, youth unemployment would peak at around 20%, and the birth rate would fall sharply. The People's Bank of China would cut rates, and the renminbi would weaken against the dollar. All the while, the property crisis was deepening. While these crises were deepening, Xi Jinping would secure his 3rd term during the 20th Congress, with Xi thought officially enshrined. During this time, the Russo-Ukrainian War would begin. Shortly before the war had begun, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin had announced a no-limit strategic partnership. The relationship between Russia and China is a bit tricky, and one that is largely misunderstood in the West. Many Westerners look at them, particularly Westerners who think of them both as grave existential enemies, and think that these two bad dictators are best friends. That's not the case. By this point, there was some substantial cooperation between the two countries, though largely it fell on the rules of there are no friends in geopolitics, only alignments of interest. Cooperation between the two was mutually beneficial. The place where the two really aligned was in opposition to the control over resource pricing and flow that was maintained in the West, and against the geostrategic hegemony of the United States. The idea of them being really close friends is quite uneasy, as they had had tensions going back to the days of the Soviet Union, including not only doctrinal communist disputes over nationalism and internationalism, but reaching the level of direct territorial disagreement as well. The two countries coming very close to serious hot war, particularly over the lands of Outer Manchuria. As the Russo-Ukrainian War began, the Chinese were markedly neutral. In UN General Assembly votes of condemnation, the Chinese would abstain. The Chinese did not jump to Russia's aid. While Western media has framed the relationship as the Chinese helping out the Russians, what really happened is that as Russia was closed out of Western markets, the Chinese spotted an opportunity. Bilateral trade would increase by around 30% the next year. The two had entered into a partnership, the Russians selling energy resources into China, and the Chinese selling manufactured goods to the Russians. This, of course, had the upfront economic benefit for the two, the Russians being able to continue their energy exports, and the Chinese being able to buy cheap energy. But more than that, it was an enormous opportunity to cut out the Western financial mechanism. If the two were able to demonstrate that they could maintain enormous trade outside of Western payment rails, and particularly with one of the two currently under sanctions, then this was paving the way for an entirely new financial apparatus. The two were building a parallel system outside of the Western financial apparatus that they had been in conflict with for multiple centuries. The Chinese would criticize American hegemony, and the Biden government in the United States would take a harsher stance against the Chinese. The Chinese and the Russians were attempting to build around the United States and the European financial empires. If they could wedge free of the dollar payment rails, the euro-dollar credit system, and the commodity pricing mechanism that was dominated by London finance, then that would be an enormous move towards sovereignty on the part of the two nations. 2023 would see an end to their aggressive lockdown policy, with rapid reopening following. There would be renewed anti-corruption campaigns, this time particularly focused on the financial sector and the military. Xi would increase and consolidate his power within the government, and GDP growth would rebound to 5.2%. Youth unemployment, however, would persist at around 21% as a peak that year. There would be attempts to stabilize the property sector, and all the while, financial problems were growing. That year would see record lows for birth rates, and the age demographic imbalance was really a severe concern. The rift between China and the West was deepening, and foreign investment would decline sharply. The Shanghai index would fall around 11% that year, and bond yields would fall to support the economy. Both China and Russia had very clearly set out on a course to build sovereign spheres outside of Western control. All the while, those Western powers, who had been trying to grab a hold of China while being forced out by the Xi government, were beginning to pivot to a much more aggressive stance. Government and media campaigns would begin talking about a conflict with China as though it was inevitable. More and more would Western populations hear that China might invade Taiwan and that there might be a war. Anti-China hawkishness was getting extremely aggressive, while internally, factions were divided. There was a military faction that very much wanted to simply seize Taiwan and was willing to fight with Western powers and the United States if it came to it. The wolf warrior archetype was growing in China, and particularly amongst the young, there was a renewed popularity of Mao, with images of national sovereignty, greatly motivating the young. This was becoming a tougher, more masculine China, one that thought of itself as able to stand against the world. All the while, crackdowns were increasing in Hong Kong. Western financial, NGO, and intelligence interests had learned that they could not infiltrate China. These centuries-old financial empires had found that they just could not crack it. Foreign capital had built enormous technical systems in China, including much of the surveillance grid. The factions aligned with Western finance and interests had become enormous, though at this point, it looked clear. Xi and the nationalists had won, and now that the possibility of roping China into the Western sphere appeared entirely off the table, the position had pivoted to raw aggression. So the new messaging went in the West: China is our enemy, and we must be prepared for the future war that will happen with China. An East versus West conflict appeared inevitable. The Russo-Ukrainian War raged. The Eastern powers and those who had aligned with them were attempting to build parallel financial apparatuses. Western countries were becoming increasingly aggressive, and more of the Chinese viewed themselves as wolf warriors, those who would one day fight the Western armies. It looked very clear where the direction of travel was going. Many in the Western elite wanted a war, a great war, and increasingly, many factions within the Chinese military wanted one as well. That was until the American administration changed. In 2025, the property crisis was lingering. The Chinese state had intervened to buy equities, the renminbi had stabilized, and adoption of the digital yuan had grown. The new Trump administration had begun new rounds of tariffs, and trade tensions with the US and EU had grown. Youth unemployment was at around 15%, and the anti-corruption crackdown was extending. China had pivoted its economic strategy to focusing on artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, and semiconductors. The new message was a focus on high-quality development. The government was emphasizing stability, stating that China needed to be a leader in these forefront fields. The United States would restrict trade of certain technologies with the Chinese, and so in 2025 there it was. There were deep internal problems in China. There were financial, demographic, and social problems. Youth dissatisfaction was very high, with many beginning to lose faith in the system. Tensions between the East and the West were mounting, and now the two were scrambling in a race over artificial intelligence. With the new trade war looming between the US and China, it looked at a cursory glance as though the inevitable conflict was coming to a head. Yet something quite curious happened. Though we can't know for sure exactly what has been discussed behind closed doors, something has changed in the US-Chinese relationship. There seems to be some understanding. For this apparatus that has been the Chinese enemy for so long, this apparatus that was the Chinese enemy when it was Jardine Matheson and the opium traders, that was the Chinese enemy when it was Western intelligence and militaries backing the Kuomintang, that was the Chinese enemy as foreign banks, NGOs, intelligence, media, and capital. This is the very same thing that the Trump administration ran its entire campaign against: the globalist apparatus. Early on in the Trump administration, there were moves against the commodity pricing mechanism that had long existed in London and in the offshore banks. There were moves against USAID. There were internal moves against agencies and apparatuses of the state. There were moves to restructure the operations of the financial system, and moves against the Eurodollar credit system, separating the onshore and offshore dollars. All the while, the administration was looking for an end to the Russo-Ukrainian war. And as time would go on, there would be moves in Latin America and the Caribbean, moving against organized crime, the laundering networks, and foreign influence. What was emerging from the United States were moves against the post-war apparatus. It was a sovereigntist vision, one that believed a country should be run for the benefit of its population and not to maximize the return to capital. Now organizations like USAID and the Open Society Foundation were in the crosshairs of the administration. What was being set up were new rails for the flow of capital around the world, one where commodity pricing would no longer be dominated by European futures markets and the rehypothecation engines of Europe. And so too, there was a new geopolitical idea. The world has always been in a state of power politics. Yet in the post-war era, there's been this idea of the rules-based order. That now there's no need for disputes and wars, that all humanity will come together and follow the rules. These rules, however, were simply the will of the Western powers. Rules that the Chinese objected to, that the Russians objected to, and now rules that the United States was objecting to, as the United States was taking the position that the world should be governed by sovereign nations and not by internationalist bodies. It had found alignment with the Chinese. The United States and China didn't become friends, yet neither had the Russians and the Chinese become friends either. They had found alignment. They both wanted to take commodity pricing dominance away from these old banks. They both wanted to assert national sovereignty. They both wanted to eliminate the power of internationalist bodies and globalist NGOs. They both wanted a fundamental system away from this apparatus. And so yes, the two fought. Yes, there were trade disputes, but it began to appear that the countries were negotiating their positions for the future, that they were figuring out how to carve up their future spheres, yet that in the present, they had found alignment. The stakes were becoming very high, and internally, opposition to Xi Jinping was rising, not from some groundswell of the population, but from opposing factions internally. It's very difficult to say for certain much of what has happened internally. So much of Chinese politics is very opaque. What may or may not have happened is that Xi had briefly disappeared for some medical problem, and upon his return, found that others in the party were solidifying a position in opposition, attempting to wrest power away from him. What appears to have emerged is that more foreign-friendly elements of the Shanghai Gang and some of the more hawkish within the military, particularly those affiliated with other princelings, have taken an opportunity to coalesce against him. While it is difficult to corroborate, over roughly the past year, it appears as though his position has weakened, with, in particular, Zhang Yusha, a very old princeling friend of his, rising into a more dominant position of power. There are different scenarios on the table. One is that long-simmering resentments within the party simply got too great, and particularly after he had secured his third term, and after so many purges, an opportunity by those who were weary of Xi was seized to squish down his power. What also looks quite probable is that as Xi had solidified his power, and particularly as agreement appeared to be emerging between the US and China, those more Western financial associated entities, particularly those around the Shanghai Gang, and those affiliated with Hong Kong Capital, had made a move to wrest power away from Xi, and to make sure that the US, Russia, and China did not align into a new sovereigntist era away from the European globalist apparatus of old. Regardless, in January of 2026, Xi would begin military purges, including CNC Vice Chairman Zhang Yusha and Joint Staff Department Chief Lu Zhenli, two very significant players to take off the board. It is very difficult to give a clear read of the balance of power within China. In recent weeks, Xi has given two high-profile speeches emphasizing continuity, technology, and a strong start. It does appear as though Xi has re-solidified his position, at least to some extent. That is going to be a very sensitive matter to keep a close eye on. Something that one will quickly find while following China is that so much of what happens in Chinese politics comes from rumors. Normally, in Western countries, rumors aren't given that much credence. How often has an anonymous source told a media company something that turns out to have just been made up by the media company? Unfortunately, in China, rumors is how most information works. So it's not clear what is going to happen within the Chinese halls of power. Will foreign capital-aligned elements take hold in China and steer it away from this US-Russia-China sovereigntist globe vision that excludes the old European powers? Particularly as more wolf warrior young officers get older, is it possible that an aggressively hawkish military will take over on its own? The future is unclear, yet for now, there are strong indications through very aggressive purges, and even some indications of agreement from party elders that Xi is grabbing power and re-solidifying his position. China is on the verge of some very different futures. Many in the West are saying that the Chinese economy is doomed and it's going to collapse. Yet it's worth keeping in mind that those same voices have been saying that for the past 30 years. At the same time, there are some very deep problems in the Chinese economy. There's a real debt problem, and there's a real problem in their real estate sector. Yet the most fundamental problem seems to be social. The demographic imbalance is deeply troubling, and so much of their young population have just given up hope. Particularly amongst young men, the adage of "let it rot" has become quite popular. The Chinese state has begun its 5-year plan, focusing on new quality production forces. This plan is particularly aimed at artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, and military technology. They are attempting to shift to consumer-led growth, and while they have shown a willingness to engage in stimulus, they are very weary to avoid large welfare expansions, due to how concerned they are with the national debt. More than the national debt, there's an estimated 13 trillion in total local government debt. And keep in mind when one looks at GDP, that government expenditure is included. Within China, much of the spending occurs on the provincial government level, and there is a little bit of paying the other provinces in a circular fashion that has resulted in some better than real GDP numbers. This is positive for the national government in one sense, as it makes their economy look more robust. Yet at the same time, the debt problem is something that they can no longer ignore, and particularly if there are further cracks in the real estate sector, a potentiality which looks most likely, then there could be a real cascading problem in the Chinese credit market as a whole, and all the while, their workforce is shrinking. The government has put forward the idea of tech sovereignty, a policy of self-reliance, focusing on semiconductor and AI development. Their idea is a domestic focus with global integration. That sense of national and cultural pride is very important, particularly as there has been more economic instability. Messaging from the government has shifted heavily to cultural confidence, aiming to get young people engaged with a more nationalist enthusiasm. They put forward the idea of the Chinese dream, of a country of great growth, innovation, and wealth creation. And internationally, via online influencers, there have been many efforts to show China in the light of an innovative and futuristic country. They put in great efforts to showcase their Tier 1 cities, presenting themselves with a sort of sci-fi image. Yet at the same time, they maintain a great degree of government control over media. It is a heavily censored country, with concerns over dissent growing more and more present. There are some, particularly amongst the younger populations, who are dissatisfied with this, though the image presented in the West of a miserable and oppressed population is itself just contrary propaganda. China does have real problems, and there is real dissatisfaction, but that doesn't mean it's falling apart, and that doesn't mean the population as a whole is miserable. China can be very difficult because the level of propaganda is so immense. Both on the one hand, the limitations that the Chinese government places on its people, limiting what they can send out to the rest of the world, and how propagandized people are in the West. There now exists a divide, with more collectivist older generations, and an increasing sense of individualism amongst the younger. There are attitudes that really hadn't been present in China before. Yet at the same time, there are many of the young who are looking to Mao, who instead of becoming more Western and individualistic, are seeking a sense of Chinese national pride, looking to the early days of the revolution, looking to that feeling of throwing off foreign control. And so much of that comes down to they just want to feel dignified. Particularly if you're a young man who feels that there's no future, then the idea of being part of some heroic fight, one that ends in your pride and dignity, is a very appealing idea. There is both very high youth unemployment, and amongst those who are employed, there is a very intense work culture, with very long days and very harsh demands. This has led to the notions of Tanping and Bailan, laying flat, as in just do nothing, and let it rot. As a result, much of the older population view the young as apathetic and unpatriotic, while the young see the old as out of touch. This all comes on the back of rising housing costs, and that goes back to that earlier predicament. The Chinese can't afford for their real estate sector to drop. The real estate sector is so fundamental to their credit system, to a level that surpasses the West. Yet in order to gain stability, and in order to get their younger populations on board, they need housing to be affordable. At the same time, the urban-rural divide remains steep. The urban population is much more consumerist, while the rural more traditionalist. Many in rural regions continue to feel neglected. Many feel that the urban regions have drifted away, particularly as there have been some influences from the West. Ideas of feminism have crept in, as have ideas supportive of homosexuality. By and large, Chinese culture is not supportive of these Western liberal notions, yet there are Western liberal ideas present in urban areas, something which the traditionalists in rural regions object to, feeling that the culture of the country has drifted apart. There is a bit of a nationalism versus cosmopolitanism divide, and while development and wealth has deviated so substantially, there is a feeling of labor exploitation, Many of the young rural population have attempted to migrate to urban areas, yet this in turn threatens the production of the rural regions and the balance of the national economy, and thus there have been restrictions placed on internal migration. At the same time, China is an enormous economy. It is a very old civilization. China does have problems it's facing, yet at the same time it has new opportunities. And in this changing world order, it appears as though it may be reaching an understanding with the United States, and it may be given a much better slice of this new world order than that of the 20th century. Within Chinese state media, these divides within the country are downplayed as Western misconceptions. Western media, however, says that China is extremely divided, and that it is a crisis. Western media says that the Chinese state has weak legitimacy, and that this new nationalist effort is just the Communist Party managing fragility. If one looks on social media, the general picture that emerges is that there are indeed divides, yet there is a tone of optimism, that nonetheless the country will move forward, and that China remains a stable nation. What's generally described is that internal conflicts are more personal, social, divides like differences between the young and old, or cultural differences between the rural and urban, and not that they are true political divides. Western media talks of very sharp faction divides, speaking of power conflicts within the state. Yet one thing that is not explained to Western populations is that there aren't factions in the way that they're normally thought of in the West. In China, factions are largely based on personal ties and loyalties, people who share similar backgrounds, such as the Princelings or the Shanghai Gang. Western media speaks of Xi's crackdowns as desperate power grabs, while Chinese media describes the anti-corruption campaigns as successful and the government as unified. Yet nonetheless there do appear to be factions. The Princelings, Xi's core, they are largely focused around party loyalty and Chinese nationalism. This faction is made up of those who are the children of the older generations of Communist Party leadership, making up much of the security apparatus, military, and the ideological institutes. Estimates place Princelings at around 40 to 50% of the top posts. There's the Shanghai Gang, those associated with Jiang Zemin. They tend to be a coastal faction, more inclined toward economic liberalization. They as well have been one of the cracks where those more aligned with foreign capital have crept in. At this point they appear to be weakened, yet remain influential in economic policies and state-owned enterprise. Estimates place them at around 20 to 30% of Politburo seats. There's the Communist Youth League, those associated with Hu Jintao. They can be largely described as technocrats from humble backgrounds, focused on social welfare and inland development. They have become severely diminished in purges, now holding only less than 10 of the influential seats. They primarily continue in provincial roles. This has been another place where foreign and corrupting interests have been identified by Xi and his faction, and by all accounts that seems to be a reasonable assessment. There are some emerging and more minor factions, particularly military hawks. While the PLA are loyal to Xi, there are some with independent agendas, and particularly as young wolf warriors grow in prominence, this hawk faction could become quite powerful. At the same time, the direct tech and business factions outside of the party, a spot particularly susceptible to foreign and corrupting influences, have been aggressively cracked down on in recent years. Outside of these, there remain regional cliques, those who exist provincially. Xi and the Princelings have been able to ally with some of these. The question now is just how dominant Xi is. It's been quite notable to notice that over the past couple years, some media more critical of Xi has been beginning to emerge in China. It hasn't been outright hostile to Xi, certainly not like what someone would see in the West, but it's taken a more skeptical tone, something which would have never been seen a decade ago. State media maintains that the factions don't exist and are entirely a Western fabrication, or if they acknowledge their existence, they say that they were eradicated by Xi's anti-corruption purges. The media maintains that the government is unified, and that the purges brought discipline. Western media speaks of persistent factions, says that Xi has overreached and risks backlash. Western media describes Xi as paranoid, and that he's signaling fragility. Yet if one looks to social media, he will see that there are hints and rumors of loyalty tests, that the factions are real, but they're personal and not structured. This appears to be the closest to the truth. There are always going to be factions and groups that people form. People organize along personal lines. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there are organized and fiercely opposed factions engaged in a power battle. Yet, recent months have shown us that there is some internal conflict. And now the question remains whether Xi will be able to gain all of his power back. We have explored China from the days of the Century of Humiliation. We have seen a civilization brought to its lowest point, and we have seen it rise to become something that the great powers of the world came to fear. This is a remarkable civilization, one that almost certainly is going to remain a major force in the coming world order. It appears as though there is going to be some sort of understanding between the US, Russia, and China. And really, that's how it has to be. Unless China were to fundamentally collapse, it has a seat at the table. There will no doubt continue to be efforts to infiltrate and gain influence in China, and efforts to bring the East and West to war with each other. Yet at least at present, the direction seems to be against those outcomes. China has real problems, yet China is not doomed. China has remarkable potential, yet that doesn't mean that China is going to take over the world. China is a particularly difficult country as the propaganda around it is so immense. One can watch Hassan Piker's visit and be told that China is the future. Or one can turn on Steve Bannon and be told that we need to bomb them tomorrow. Yet these, as are so often the case, are just stories. China has an incredible past, and it is such an old civilization. It is different from the West, and trying to understand it in a Western framework will not work. Though it is different, that does not make it bad. Nor does that mean we should excuse away its wrongdoings. China is messy, and that's just the way civilizations are. China can be great, and it can be terrible. Yet China is most certainly remarkable. And after exploring its history and seeing what it has been through, perhaps the thing that the Westerners should learn to give China is respect. You do not have to love China. You do not have to want to be like China. You do not have to hate China. You do not have to want war with China. But you should respect China. As this new global order solidifies, China is going to have a very large role to play. There are many questions up in the air, and the China of the future could look like many different things. It's a place to take very seriously. It's a place that's worth understanding. And hopefully, after seeing the Century of Humiliation and where it has come from, it can earn a little bit more of that understanding.